So then a function is said to be an analytic function. So it's not quite, at least looking at the definition that I've given, it's not quite obvious that a power series will automatically be an analytic function, right? But it does turn out to be true. So the point is, suppose you have a power series f with a disk of convergence. Let's say it is centered at this point P. So it's centered at this point P and has some radius of convergence capital R, which is strictly positive. Then to check whether this is an analytic function, you should take some arbitrary point Z0 in the disk and show that locally near Z0, it has another power series expansion, but centered at this point Z0. That is the key point. You want it to be centered at the point Z0. And in fact, that can be done by a simple application of the binomial theorem. So I'm sure Suman must have shared the lecture notes, the typed up lecture notes. So if you want a proof of this, you can take a look at the typed up lecture notes. But the idea is that in this small disk of radius r, little r, right? And what is this little r? This is basically, so you can take little r to be capital R minus the distance of Z0 from P. You can actually then write your function f of z as summation n equal to 0 to infinity. You can change the center of your power series to Z0. Sorry. This should be Z minus Z0. Okay, and in general, this new power series might have a radius of convergence strictly bigger than this little r. Okay, where little r is defined like this. So we ended the lecture with this example. So if you remember, we just took the usual geometric series. So you take summation z to the n. Right, so that we know has a radius of convergence of 1 and it's centered at 0. So it's basically a convergent power series in this little disk. And then the idea is you take, so here P is 0. Then you take this point Z0 is minus half. And we expanded this as a power series around Z0. And let me remind you what the answer was. So f of z restricted to this disk of radius little r around Z0 turned out to be 2 by 3 times summation n going from 0 to infinity, 2 by 3 to the n, and z plus half to the n. Okay, and if you notice, this is a new power series, and this actually has radius of convergence equal to 3 halves. Even though what was r was basically by definition capital R minus Z0, absolute value of Z0, but capital R is 1, absolute value of Z0 is 2, little r was half. Okay, but it turns out that if you expand it around this, the resulting power series actually has a larger radius of convergence than predicted. So you can actually, it will converge on this huge ball, okay, of radius 3 halves. All right, any questions from, so this was all that we had covered, at the end of lecture 2. So any questions from this?
Sir?
Yep.
Sir, how you calculate the coefficient an in the above slide?
Where? Here?
No, above.
Oh, here.
Yeah, an equal to fn z0 upon n.
Yeah. So let me do this calculation for n equal to 1, let's say. Okay. So how would you compute a1? So now I've already told you what the derivative of f is as a power series, right? So f prime is this. So if you write the first few terms, it will be a1 plus a2 z minus z naught plus a3 z minus z naught squared. Sorry, this should be 2 times this plus 3 times this and so on, right?
Yes.
So now just plug in z equal to z naught. That basically tells you that a1 is equal to f prime at z naught, right? Because all these other terms will cancel out, because z minus z naught would be 0 at z naught, right?
Okay. So similarly, calculate for another derivative.
Yeah, exactly. Similarly, if you do f double prime,
Yes.
that will turn out to be, I mean, the first term will be 2a2 plus the next term will be 6a3 times z minus z naught and so on, right?
Yes.
So f2 at z naught will actually be 2 times a2. So a2 is f2 at z naught by 2, right?
Yes.
And so on. So just keep doing this. So you get the n factorial because every time you differentiate, you're pulling down one power, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
That is, if f is analytic in a domain, then for
Right.
each point belongs to some domain, we have some power series function for that function. Conversely, suppose if f of z can be written as some power series, then f is analytic on that domain, sir.
Can you repeat? Sorry, your voice got cut off.
So, by the definition of the analytic function, if it is analytic in the domain, we can expand some power series using that function. Okay, sir. Conversely, suppose f is analytic. F can be written as some power series expansion. Then it is analytic at that point only.
No, the entire disk of convergence. That is the point of this statement. So suppose f is given by some power series expansion, then f is analytic on the entire disk of convergence.
Okay, sir. That is where the power series convergent region of the convergence, all that points
Exactly.
will be analytic. Suppose outside that point, it may be analytic.
No. So outside the power series anyway diverges, right? So it doesn't even make sense to talk about it as a function anymore, right? Because outside the disk of convergence, the power series diverges.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
All right.
One by. So we define one function like 1 plus z square, which is 1 by 1 minus z. We got like that power series. That is a geometric series.
Yeah. So that's the point, right? But this is not equal to 1 by 1 minus z everywhere. This is only for mod z less than 1, right? So when you give me a function that is defined by a power series, that automatically comes with a radius of convergence. You cannot talk about the power series outside of the radius of convergence or outside the disk of convergence, right?
Yes, sir. Okay, sir. Suppose I take f of z equal to 1 by 1 minus z.
Right.
But 1 by 1 minus z is converges every, it's analytic every point other than z equal to.
So she is confusing with she is confusing with analytic continuation and the radius of convergence.
Yeah. So Deepa, you're absolutely right that this particular function is actually analytic on the entire complex plane minus the point z equals 1, right? But the power series is analytic only on the disk of convergence of the power series. Okay, is that clear? So maybe I'll use different letters. Let's call this f and let's call this g of z, let's say. Okay. So then G restricted to this unit disk happens to be equal to f of z, right? So you call, then we call G the analytic continuation of f, okay? Does that make sense?
Okay, sir.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So,
Sir,
yeah.
sir, a function is analytic if it has power series expansion. So 1 upon 1 minus z is analytic outside the unit disk. So what will be the power series for 1 upon 1 minus z outside that disk?
That's a good exercise. You can try. So for instance, yeah. So maybe it's a good exercise. So let's see. So maybe I'll write it as an exercise. So expand G of Z as a power series centered at some Z naught such that mod Z naught is strictly bigger than 1. Okay. So for instance, as an example, you can take, let's say, Z naught is 2. Okay. And try to expand this as a power series. So the idea is that if you want to expand this as a power series around 2, you would like exponents of this type, right? So the hint is to do the following. You basically write 1 by 1 minus z. I mean, there are multiple ways of doing this. So the hard way, I'll first tell you the hard way. But the hard way is good because it works in general. Okay. So the hard way is to basically compute these things, right? Once you get these coefficients, I mean, then basically 1 by 1 minus z will basically just be this. Okay. But the easy way, there's actually a much easier way to do this. So the easy way would be to observe the following. You can write 1 by 1 minus z as 1 minus. You want the center to be at 2. So you want something like z minus 2 to show up, right? Minus 2. So this is going to be minus 1 by, let's see. So how should I write this? So this is minus 1, right? Okay.
Yes, sir.
So these two are the same things, and then you notice that if mod z minus 2 is less than 1, then you can actually expand this as a geometric series. This is basically minus this raised to n, right? And then you just get the the series expansion at z not equal to 2. Okay, so that's the easy way to do this. But I would suggest that you should do it both ways and compare the answers and check that you get the same answer both ways. Okay.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So perhaps maybe we can continue. It's already 20 minutes into the lecture. So so I want to start today's lecture with a very nice consequence of analyticity, namely the principle of analytic continuation. Okay, so here's a proposition. So suppose now I'm going to assume that omega is connected. And of course, as usual, it's open. So last class, I think the first lecture, somebody asked me if we also want omega to be connected. In general, we just want it to be open, but for the principle of analytic continuation, we actually want it to be connected. Okay, so suppose omega is connected and let f be some analytic function. Okay, suppose there exists a P such that all the derivatives at P vanish. Okay, so K equal to 0, 1, 2, etc. So by the way, when I say the 0th derivative vanishes, this in particular means that I'm assuming that f of P is also equal to 0. Okay, so the 0th derivative by definition is just the value of the function at that point. Okay, so suppose all derivatives vanish, then we have this beautiful conclusion that f is identically 0 on omega. Okay, so maybe if people are not familiar with this notation, what I want to say is that f of z is equal to 0 for all z in omega. Okay, and as a nice consequence of this is the following. Suppose omega is connected, and of course, as usual, open, and let's say f is analytic. Suppose there is an open set U such that f restricted to U is identically 0, then this implies in fact that f will be identically 0 on all of omega. So just think about this. I mean, this is quite beautiful, right? Because you take an open set, suppose there is a tiny open set here. On which f is 0, then this actually implies that even if you take any other point very far away from that open set, f will automatically be 0 there, just from this assumption of analyticity. Okay, so this is quite a remarkable consequence. So let's look at the proof of the proposition. So by the way, should I didn't ask this, but is the writing too small, or should I again go to maybe landscape? Would that be better? Or?
Sir, please provide proof. Hint for this.
Oh yeah, I'm going to prove this. But is the writing too small, or should I?
So it's fine. That is
Okay, sir, writing.
It's fine.
Sir,
Right?
landscape would be better, sir.
Landscape would be better. Okay. Let me. Yeah, that's better, right? Okay.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. So let's prove the proposition. Okay. So this is a standard argument from topology. Whenever you have a connected set, so we are going to use the following fact. Suppose omega is connected and S in omega is a non-empty set which is both open and closed in omega. Right, so that means the set of limit points of S in omega are all contained in S, and S is also open in omega. Then this implies that S will have to be equal to omega. Okay, this is a basic fact from point set topology. If you haven't seen this, maybe you should take. You should believe me for now. You should take it at face value, and then maybe you can go back and try to look up a proof. Okay. But everything in topology to do with connected sets, almost everything basically boils down to this simple fact, right? Okay, so how are we going to use this? So the key is to somehow define this set S, okay? So one obvious candidate for S is that it's the set of points where the function takes the value 0. But it turns out that that does not quite work, because that doesn't allow us to use the power of analyticity. So instead, I'm going to use the following definition. So let S be the set of all points in omega such that the kth derivative at Z is 0 for all k equal to 0, 1, 2, etc. Okay, so that's my definition of the set S. Okay, so note that by hypothesis, this point P already belongs to S, right? Because that was the hypothesis in the theorem. The hypothesis was that the function value and all the subsequent derivatives at P vanish. Okay. So by hypothesis, clearly P will belong to my set S, which implies that S is non-empty. Okay. Now, in order to use the fact, I have to first prove that S is closed in omega, and then I have to prove that S is open in omega. So how do you do this? So let Z0 in omega be a limit point of S. So by definition of limit points, this implies there exists a sequence Zn in S such that Zn converges to Z0. Okay. But now what is so if you let k equal to 0, 1, 2, etc., what is fk at Zn? That is 0 by assumption, right? Because Zn belongs to S. So the function value and the kth derivatives at Zn are all 0. But then, as you let n go to infinity, all of this converges to fk at Z0. Why? What property am I using here? So you have a sequence Z. Pardon?
Continuous.
Continuity, right? So you have a sequence Zn going to Z0. Then remember that fk is differentiable. In particular, fk is also continuous. So if Zn converges to Z0, fk at Zn will converge to fk at Z0. So in particular, this implies that fk at Z0 is 0, but this happens for all k 0, 1, 2, etc. So then by definition, this implies that Z0 is in the set that I started off with, right? So it means you started with a limit point, and now you have shown that that limit point is actually contained in S. So this implies that S is closed in omega. Okay, so that completes the first part of the proof. The second part is to show that S is open. Okay, so let's see how to argue. So how do you show something is open? So take a point Z0 in S. What is the goal? There exists a R such that the ball of radius R around Z0 is contained in S. Right? Then that will show that S is an open set. Okay, but how do you do this? So by analyticity. So remember, Z0 is some point in omega, right? It's a point in S, but it's also a point in omega. So because our function is analytic, so let me maybe draw. Right, so you have a Z0. because it's analytic, you know that there is a power series expansion in the neighborhood of this. So analyticity will imply that there exists a R, of course, depending on the Z0, such that F restricted to the disk of radius R around Z0 is basically given by its Taylor expansion. Okay, but all of these guys are equal to 0. Why? Because Z0 belongs to S. So by definition, if Z0 belongs to S, the function value and all subsequent derivatives is 0. So this implies that this is 0. So this implies that F restricted to this disk is identically 0. But if a function is identically 0, this implies for all Z in this little disk, all the derivatives will be 0. But then by definition, this implies that this entire disk is contained in the set S. So that's what I wanted to prove, right? Okay, so this is a very standard sort of method of proving things when you're dealing with connected sets. Okay, is that clear? Any questions? Okay, if not, then I'll proceed to sort of the main topic for today, namely elementary functions. So I want to start off with the most important function of them all, the exponential function. So I think I defined this in the second lecture, but let's do it again. So here's a definition. So we define the exponential function from C to C by way of a power series. So exponential of Z is summation n going from 0 to infinity, Z to the n by n factorial. Because it's such an important function, let's write down the first few terms. So you have things like this. And so on, right? And the remark is that the radius of convergence, we calculated that last time, is actually infinity. So this is a holomorphic function on all of C. Okay. So let's calculate the derivative. So remember, the derivative can be computed by taking the term by term derivative. So let's just look at this series. If you differentiate 1, that's 0. If you differentiate Z, you get 1. Then if you differentiate Z squared, you get 2 times Z. But then you have a 2 factorial down below. Then you get 3 times Z squared by 3 factorial and so on. Right, so in general, you are going to basically get something like this, n going from 1 to infinity, n times Z to the n minus 1 by n factorial. Okay, so you can of course cancel one of these n's and simplify this to be this. Okay, but now you notice if you just make a change of variables, if you put n minus 1 equal to k, then this is basically just the summation k going from 0 to infinity z to the k by k factorial. Okay, but that's precisely the exponential function that we started off with. So you notice that if you differentiate the exponential function, you get back the same thing. Okay, and then of course inductively you can keep doing this again and again. So if you take the kth derivative of the exponential function, that's going to be the exponential function again. Okay, so this is this remarkable function which if you keep differentiating, you again keep getting back the same function. And in a minute, we are going to prove that this is actually the only such function possible. Okay, so we'll get to that in a minute. But let me first state the following theorem on some of the nice properties of the exponential function. Okay, so firstly, exponential of 0 is equal to 1. Okay. Secondly, exponential of z plus w. So this is the famous property of exponents, that addition is converted to multiplication. Okay, so we'll prove this property rather than, I guess when we first learn about these things in high school, this is sort of given as this miraculous property that exponents satisfy. But we are going to actually prove this from just the power series expansion. Okay, then another nice property is that if you take exponential of minus z, that turns out to be 1 divided by exponential of z. Okay, so again, this is another nice property that we learn about in high school, but I mean, actually 3 follows quite easily from 2. We'll see that in a minute. Moreover, for any complex number z, exponential of z can never be equal to 0. Okay, so even, I mean, this is something that we are used to with the real exponential function, but this is also true for the complex exponential function. Okay, and then finally, let's restrict e to the z to the real number line. So remember the complex plane contains the real number line, right? You can think of that as the sort of x-axis sitting inside the complex plane. So the restriction is a strictly monotonic positive function. Okay, moreover, we have that this is equal to 1 if and only if x is actually equal to 0. So the only real number for which e to the x will be equal to 1 is when x is 0. Okay. And in fact, we also have the following limit. So the limit as x goes to plus infinity of e to the x is plus infinity. And limit as x goes to minus infinity of e to the x is 0. Okay, so as a consequence, in particular, if you look at this function e to the x from r to r plus, so these are basically the positive reals. Then this is actually an onto function or surjective function. Okay. Right, so let's prove this. So the first is trivial. right? So what this says is that if you plug in z equal to 0, then you get 1, which is obvious if you look at the power series expansion, right? Because if you put z equal to 0, all of these terms will cancel out, so you just get 1. So that is obvious. Let's prove the second property. The second property is this famous rule of exponents. Okay, so I'm not going to prove this completely, but I'm going to indicate how to prove this, and it's a good exercise to try to work out the proof by yourself. Okay, so let's look at what is x for z plus w. By definition, this is basically the power series z plus w to the n by n factorial, right? But then I can use binomial theorem. So this is by the binomial theorem. I can rewrite this as n going from 0 to infinity 1 by n factorial. I mean z plus w to the n I can expand as the summation from k 0 to n choose k, z to the k, w to the n minus k. Okay. But what is 1 by n factorial times n choose k? Well, you just write out the definition of n choose k. So that's 1 by n factorial times what is n choose k? That is n factorial by k factorial times n minus k factorial, which is 1 by n minus k factorial times k factorial. Okay, so plug that in. So this implies that the exponential of z plus w is summation n going from 0 to infinity, summation k going from 0 to n. I'm going to now combine this 1 by n factorial and n choose k and write that as this. Okay, but now it's not difficult to check that this is simply the product of two power series, namely this times j going from 0 to infinity, w to the j by j factorial. Okay, but then this is precisely exponential of z, and this is precisely exponential of w. Okay, so this is, if you're not familiar with this, this is basically the Cauchy product theorem. Right, so given two power series, how do you multiply the power series to get another power series? That is what the Cauchy product theorem is all about. And you can check that, that this summation here is precisely the product of these two power series. So that completes our proof. We started with this and we ended up with the product of the two exponential functions. Right, so just from starting from first principles, starting from the power series, we have now proved this law of exponents that we study in high school, right? Okay, so let's prove the third part. So what was the third part? That was basically that the exponential of minus z is equal to 1 by exponential of z. For that, just put just put w equal to minus z in part 2. So then you basically get exponential of z minus z, which is exponential of 0, which is 1. So maybe I should write it like this. So we already know that the exponential of 0 is 1, but you can write exponential of 0 as exponential of z minus z, which you can, by property 2, this is the same as this. Okay. So that implies that exponential of minus z is 1 by exponential of z. Okay. So that proves property 3. For property 4, we have to show that there is no z There is no complex number for which the exponential is 0, right? But that's, I mean, that follows easily from part 3, because suppose there exists a Z0 such that the exponential of Z0 is 0. Okay, but then we have already seen that that if you multiply exponential of Z0 and exponential of minus Z0, you basically get 1, right? But on the other hand, if this is 0, this will be 0, so that's a contradiction. Right, so there is no Z0 for which the exponential takes the value 0. Okay, finally, we have to analyze what happens when you restrict the exponential function. So I should not write e to the x, I should write x of x. Okay, here x is some real number. Okay, so let's differentiate this with respect to x. Actually, before that, let's first understand that exponential of 0 is 1, right? So suppose there exists an x0 such that the exponential of x0 is a negative number. Then what can you say? That, I mean, suppose there is an x0, let's say, I mean, if you look at the graph, let's say there is a point at 0 where this takes the value 1. And suppose there is another point, let's say x0 here, where you have x of x0 less than 0. Then by the intermediate value theorem, it has to cross 0 at some point, right? But we have already shown that the exponential function cannot take the value 0. Okay, so then the intermediate value theorem, I'll denote that by IVT, implies that x of some y0 is equal to 0 for some y0, but then this is a contradiction. Okay, because this is positive. So this implies that the exponential function is positive for all x in R. Okay. So then let's differentiate this. That's the favorite thing to do if you are given a real valued function, you want to understand its behavior, just differentiate if it is differentiable, right? So if we differentiate this, this will again turn out to be the exponential function. So this is strictly positive, which implies that the exponential function is strictly increasing. Okay, so then I'll leave the other parts to you. So so because it's strictly increasing, in particular it is 1-to-1. So this also implies that exponential of x is 1-to-1. Okay, so what this implies is that exponential of x equal to 1 will automatically imply that x is equal to 0. Because restricted to the real line, this is a 1-to-1 function. Similarly, you can also prove the other properties. Okay. All right. Any questions?
Sir. Hello.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sir, in that proof of exponential is non-zero, no, sir? Use that, sir, that last. So like if exponential of z0 is 0, then all the derivative at z0 will be 0.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's a good point. So one can also give an alternate proof using analytic continuation. So an alternate proof of part, I guess it was 3 or 4, right? Yeah. So 4 is that suppose there exists a z0 such that exponential of z0 is 0, then this implies that all derivatives at z equal to z0, we know they're all equal to exponential of z0, they'll all be 0. But then by the principle of analytic continuation, implies that the exponential function is a constant. Okay, but on the other hand, you can check easily that, for instance, exponential of even 1 for that matter, right? So this is summation 1 by n factorial, n going from 0 to infinity is actually strictly bigger than 1. So it cannot be equal to 1. Okay, so yeah, you're absolutely right. You can also give an alternate proof this way. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so another remark is that from now, we will use the notation, the more sort of suggestive notation. Exponential of z, we'll denote it by e raised to z. Okay. So we'll use both the notations interchangeably. Okay, so there is a very nice consequence of this theorem. It's actually just one sec. Yeah, so there's a very nice consequence of these properties of the exponential function. Namely, there exists a unique function f, which is holomorphic on all of C, such that it has the following two properties: that f prime of z is always equal to f of z, and f of 0 is equal to 1. Okay. So in fact, this is the only possible function which has the property that it's the derivative of itself. Assuming this initial condition that, so you should think of this a differential equation. So whenever you have a first order differential equation, you need one constant of integration, right? So you can also think of this as sort of the constant of integration. And the proof is rather simple. So we just consider the following. Let this be the exponential of minus z times f of z. So what is the goal? The goal is to show that this is actually, this is actually identically 1. Okay, so if you want to show that a function is identically equal to 1, the best thing is to try to differentiate it, right? So what is g prime of z? We use chain rule. This is minus x puff minus z times f of z plus x puff minus z times f prime of z, right? But we are assuming that f prime of z is equal to f of z, so you can check that this is going to be 0 because f prime is equal to f of z. Okay. So here's a fact. If g prime is identically equal to 0 on a connected set, this implies that g is actually equal to a constant on omega. So if something has identically 0 derivative on a connected set, then that function better be a constant. And we'll actually see a proof of this tomorrow when we discuss the Cauchy-Riemann equations. Okay. So right now, just take this at face value. So this implies that g of z is actually equal to g of 0. But what is g of 0? That is the exponential of 0 times f of 0. And we are assuming both, I mean, exponential of 0 is 1. We are assuming f of 0 is 1. So this is 1, which implies that exponential of minus z times f of z is equal to 1. But then by property 3 or 4, that the exponential of minus z is equal to 1 by exponential of z, this implies f of z is equal to exponential of z. Okay. So any function that satisfies these two conditions will automatically have to be the exponential function that we have already defined. Okay. So this is kind of nice. This is the only function that has this nice property that the derivative is itself. Okay. All right. So building on this, I want to now introduce trigonometric functions. Okay. So right. So any questions on this, on the exponential function?
Hello.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Sir, we can also use that theorem also, no, sir? Because if we define gz to be fz minus exponential of z, then every derivative
Right.
will be 0 at 0.
That's
So
not
gz
quite.
equal to f.
Oh yeah, actually that's
fz
true.
minus
Could
f.
also. Right. No. But the right. So you have a good point, but one has to be a bit careful because I'm only assuming that f is. I'm only assuming that f is basically a holomorphic function, not an analytic function. You don't know yet whether f is an analytic function or not, right?
Yes, sir. Yes.
So a priori, this g of z is only a holomorphic function. It's not an analytic function. So you cannot use that theorem because that theorem was only for analytic functions, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions quickly before?
Sir,
Yeah.
Sir, I have
Yeah.
sir, is there any
Also,
difference between
it's not
holomorphic and
connected.
analytic function?
Between holomorphic and
Analytic function.
there is no difference, but this is actually one of the major theorems in complex analysis. Okay, so analytic obviously implies holomorphic by the corollary that we proved last time. But the converse is actually one of the major theorems you will hopefully prove or at least state in the next set of lectures. Okay, so that's a major goal of complex analysis, is to show that there is actually no difference between holomorphic and analytic functions. But that's a highly non-trivial theorem. Okay?
Okay, sir.
Yeah. All right.
Suppose
A question or
domain is not connected, then sir.
pardon?
So suppose
Yeah.
domain is not connected, then it may occur such types of function like this. If it is
Right. So,
connected, then we get f of x equal to.
no, but we are anyway
domain is
working
not
on.
connected, then
Yeah, but we are all anyway working on C, right? We are working on the entire complex plane, which is of course connected. Okay, so you don't have to worry about connectedness for this corollary. Okay.
Sir, one more question.
okay.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Yogesh.
Sir, in that corollary, and suppose we ignore the condition f0 is equal to 1.
Right.
So what can you say about that function f?
So that's what. So these two conditions imply that f of z is equal to exponential of z. That's what we have proved just now,
If
right?
Okay, if f0, if suppose if f0 not equal to 1 or that condition is not, we ignore that condition. So can you say that f is identically equal to exponential of z?
If we don't know this condition, or
Yes, sir.
Saying
Suppose
that if we
the
drop
second
the condition f of 0 equals to 1,
right.
still-
So suppose f of 0 is equal to some complex number a, right?
no,
Suppose
sir, ignore the condition. If f dash is equal to f z, then
right,
what can you say
right.
that?
Then so suppose you only consider the first condition, then this basically implies that f of z is actually equal to a times the exponential of z for some a. Okay.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Yeah. So a could also be 0, in which case f is the trivial function, right? But
Thank you. Thank you.
so that's what. So this is like the constant of integration. Okay. Yeah. So let's move ahead. Let's talk about trigonometric functions. So here's a definition. So we define sine and cosine by the following power series expansion. So you define sine of z to basically you pick out all the odd exponents from the exponential function. So you define it to be this. Okay, so this is the same as z minus z cube by 3 factorial plus z to the 5 by 5 factorial and so on. Okay, and similarly you define the cosine function where you pick out the even exponents and again with alternating sign. Okay, so this is going to be something like this. Okay, so this is the definition of these familiar functions from high school, sine and cosine. So one thing I really want to impress upon you, I mean, how do we learn about these trigonometric functions in high school? We basically learn sine theta as, say, I mean, you have a right angle triangle, you take sine theta as sort of opposite by hypotenuse and cos theta as the adjacent by hypotenuse. But the point is that these definitions are actually quite limited. You can't, I mean, firstly, it takes some effort to even make them into rigorous definitions, right? Because for instance, what is the length of a line segment, right? You need to do this carefully. And then the point is that you need to be able to somehow use these in analysis, right? And so it turns out that this is, I mean, if you want to do everything from first principles, this is not that easy or that convenient. So at least from a modern perspective, the idea, I mean, the right home for all of these functions, for trigonometric functions, for exponential functions, basically lies in complex analysis. Because once you define them as power series, you can actually do, I mean, stuff with them which is completely rigorous, without any sort of geometric intuition, etc. You have completely made everything into an analytic problem. Okay, so the point of this lecture was just to demonstrate that these things that we take for granted in high school, actually, I mean, if one is to define them rigorously, from at least the modern perspective, the best way to do that is using these power series expansions. And then we can actually rederive all these properties that we study in high school just from first principles, from properties of power series. Okay. So for instance, I mean, I have the following proposition that sine z and cosine z are actually holomorphic functions on the entire complex plane. Why not? Because they're defined by power series that have infinite radius of convergence. And if you calculate the derivative of sine, so you basically take this power series and differentiate it term by term, it's not very difficult to see that you'll actually get back cosine z. Similarly, if you differentiate cosine z, it's not difficult to see that you will end up with minus sine z. Okay, so I'll leave this proof as an exercise. And I think all of these, if you haven't done this before, I think all of these are very useful exercises. You should think about this. And moreover, we have this beautiful Euler identity, namely that e raised to I z is precisely cosine z plus I times sine z. Okay, so this is sometimes called the most beautiful formula in mathematics, but this is actually, I mean, once you use the right definitions, this is almost a trivial consequence. Okay, so so one of the things about doing mathematics is that as you sort of do more and more advanced things that you found miraculous when you were a high school student become almost a triviality, right? So the idea is that if you define the right things, if you define things in the right way, then theorems should, which were earlier thought to be very sophisticated, should now be sort of elementary consequences, right? And here, again, I'll leave this as an exercise. This is a very nice exercise, and the hint is the following observation, that if you take I raised to n, this is basically going to be minus 1 to the m if n is an even number, and it's going to be minus 1 to the m times I if n is an odd number. Okay, so then you basically just plug in Iz in the power series for the exponential function and separate out the real and imaginary, right, so it requires some work. So you can't just separate out into real and imaginary, but think about how to derive the Euler formula from the just the power series expansions. Okay, so it's basically a consequence of the principle of analytic continuation. Okay, so that's the hint. Right, so you can't separate it out into real and imaginary parts. That would be wrong, because your z is a complex number now. Okay, so you have to actually use the principle of analytic continuation. Okay, so I have another corollary of all these properties, or maybe let me write that down as a proposition. The sine and cosine functions satisfy the following properties. Firstly, you can put sine of 0. That's 1. That is obvious because the power series, sorry, it's 0 because the power series of sine z starts at z. So sine of z is 0. Similarly, cosine of 0 is clearly 1 because the power series begins at 1, right? So this is obvious. Another nice observation is that sine of minus z is equal to minus sine of z. Right? Why is this so? Because if you plug in minus z, you basically have all the odd powers. Minus 1 to an odd power is minus 1, right? So again, this follows trivially from the power series expansion. Similarly, cosine of minus z, because cosine has only even exponents, -1 to an even power is 1. So this is going to be cosine of z. Okay. Another nice consequence is all these sum angle formulas that we prove in high school, right? Or prove in quotes, because their definition of sine is a bit dodgy. But now that we have rigorously defined sine and cosine, we can actually prove the sum angle formulas. So sine of z plus minus w is basically sine z cosine of w plus minus cosine z sine of w. And similarly, cosine of z plus minus w is cosine z cosine w minus plus, so remember the signs reverse, sine z sine w. Okay. And then thirdly, we have our sort of famous trigonometric identity, or most favorite trigonometric identity, namely this plus this squared is 1. Okay. So again, I'll leave the proof as an exercise. If you need some help, it's all there in the typed up lecture notes. But again, if you're seeing this for the first time, I think it's good to try to prove these by yourselves, right? And maybe let me give you a hint for the sum angle formulas. This basically follows from the observation that sine z is e to the iz plus e to the minus iz by 2i, and cosine z is basically e to the iz plus, sorry, there should be a minus sign here, plus this by 2. Okay, and then you basically use our favorite law of exponents. We know that this is equal to this, right? Use these three observations to prove the sum angle formula. Okay. All right, any questions? Okay, so that brings me to a key point in the lecture, namely what is pi. Okay, so again, I mean, in right, so in olden times, of course, this was a beautiful observation that if you take the circumference of a circle divided by the diameter, that turns out to be constant, independent of what circle you pick, right? And then one can define that constant to be pi. But again, firstly, this is not completely, I mean, to make this rigorous, one has to have a notion of length of curves, right? And of course, we know by now, with the benefit of sort of hindsight of 2000 years of mathematics, that to define length, one has to introduce integral calculus, right? So sure, so once you do that, then one can possibly show that this circumference to diameter is always constant. But there's actually a much faster way of getting to pi, and that's namely through the following theorem. So I claim that there exists a smallest positive number, positive real number, of course, which we define to be pi. So note that this is a definition. We define pi to be this smallest positive real number, so which we call pi, such that if you take the exponential of 2 pi I, that is identically equal to 1. Okay. Moreover, exponential of z is equal to 1 if and only if z is actually an integral multiple of this. Okay, so this is the set of integers. This is the standard notation for set of integers. Okay, so in other words, I'm actually defining pi to be the minimum real number such that e raised to I pi, e raised to 2i pi, e raised to 2ip is actually equal to 1. Okay, so the minimum positive real number such that this happens. Okay, so that's the definition of pi, and as a consequence, we have the following elementary observation that for all z in C, we basically have this periodicity property. Okay, so let's pause for a moment and appreciate what a remarkable fact this is, right? I mean, if you go back to the definition of sine and cosine, we define these things by a power series expansion, right? Now, it's quite remarkable that the power series expansion actually turns out to be periodic. It defines a periodic function. That, I mean, it's not obvious at all looking at just the definition of sine and cosine as power series, right? So this is quite a remarkable theorem. So let's see. So I don't have time to prove this theorem today, but I promise that if we have time after tomorrow's lecture, I will give you a proof of this. So let me put this on hold for now. And I'll give a proof tomorrow if time permits. Okay, in fact, I mean, you can also just read the proof tonight from the typed lecture notes, and that proof is actually, I found that proof in Hardy's classic book on pure mathematics, right? So of course that book is now quite obsolete in many ways, but somehow this beautiful fact that you start with sine and cosine as periodic as power series, and then you get periodicity as a consequence is something that is there in that book. Okay, so tomorrow, if time permits, I'll give you a proof of this, because I guess, I mean, you probably wouldn't have seen this anywhere else, right? Hopefully. So a nice consequence of this is also that if you take sine of 2n pi, that's always going to be 0. Okay. So now I want to talk about polar coordinates, about how this periodicity has a consequence on the representation of complex numbers as polar coordinates. Okay, so let's observe something. Right, so I guess, I mean, firstly, we observe that cosine of 0 is 1. And cosine of 2n pi is also equal to 1, right? But, just by periodicity. So on the other hand, by some angle formulae, so by the sum angle formula, if you take cosine of 2 pi, that is 2 times cosine squared of pi minus 1. Okay, but we have already seen that this is 1. This implies that cosine squared of pi is 1. Okay. But we know that the quadratic equation something squared is equal to 1 has exactly two solutions, 1 or minus 1. So this implies that cosine of pi is equal to 1 or minus 1. Okay. But now recall that we have defined pi to be a positive number. Okay. Right. So actually that's not what is important. Suppose cosine of pi is actually equal to 1. Then this actually implies that sine of pi is 0. That's because sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. But then this will actually imply that e to the I pi is 1. Right? By the Euler identity. But this is a contradiction. Why? Because we have defined 2 pi to be the smallest period of e to the iz. So that's a contradiction. So this implies that cosine of pi is forced to be minus 1. Okay, that's the first observation. The second observation is that because sine squared x plus cosine squared x is equal to 1, and both sine x and cosine x are real numbers, that just follows from the power series expansion. This implies that both sine x and cosine x have to be between 1 and minus 1. Okay, but then since cosine of pi is equal to minus 1 and cosine of 0 is equal to 1, this implies that cosine of x takes all possible values. Okay, so now, just from, again, the power series expansion, we have established that cosine of x takes all possible values from minus 1 to 1. In particular, if you consider the function from R to the unit circle S1, so this is the set of all xy such that x squared plus y squared is equal to 1. And the function is that you send x to cosine x sine x. Okay, my claim is that this is surjective. So let's call this function something. Let's call this function f. My claim is that f is surjective. Okay, why is that? Because take any AB lying on the circle. So that is equivalent to the statement that a squared plus b squared is 1. Okay. So in particular, a lies between 1 and minus 1. So let x be a real number such that cosine of x is equal to a. Okay, we have already shown that cosine takes all values between minus 1 and 1. So in particular, there will be some x for which cosine of x is a. Okay. So then this implies that what is sine squared x? That is basically 1 minus a squared, because sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. Okay, but what is 1 minus a squared? That is b squared. So this implies that sine x is basically plus minus b. So suppose sine x is equal to b, then we are done. Right? Because then we have found an x so that cosine x is a, sine x is b, which means that this function f is surjective. If not, so that means suppose sine x is equal to minus b. Okay, then basically take y equal to minus x. So then cosine of y will still be cosine of minus x, which is still cosine of x, which is still a. On the other hand, what will happen to sine y? That's sine of minus x, which is minus sine x, which is minus of minus b, which is b. So again, you have successfully found a y, so that sine y is b and cos y is a. So this map f is surjective. Okay, so now what remains is to so this basically implies that right. So I have shown that this map is surjective. So the fourth observation, finally, which will help me write down the polar coordinates, is the following. So let z be some non-zero complex number. Okay, so this is the set of all complex number which is away from the origin. So then, if you look at the point z by mod z, this is clearly going to lie on the unit circle, right? Because the absolute value is 1. So then by part 3, there exists a real number theta such that z by mod z is basically e raised to I theta. Okay, because what is e raised to I theta? That is in terms of Cartesian coordinates, that's just sine theta cosine theta. Okay, I mean by Euler formula, it's just cosine theta plus I sine theta, right? So this implies that I can represent any complex number as basically this. And by periodicity, we may assume, so the standard convention is to either assume that theta lies between 0 and 2 pi, or theta, my convention will be that theta lies between minus pi and pi. Okay, so you get the polar representation. Where r is basically just absolute value of z and theta is called the argument of z. Okay, so just from these definitions, we actually get an alternative representation of a complex number in terms of what are called as polar coordinates. So this is the polar coordinate representation. Okay. So maybe I can, I wanted to also talk about the logarithm today, but I guess I'm almost out of time. So can I take 10 more minutes or should I just continue tomorrow? What is a better strategy?
I think it's better to complete today that full topic so that tomorrow you can continue other topics.
Okay, so I can, sorry, so then I can take 10 more minutes. Is that
Yes,
fine?
yes.
Or?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I'll then continue ahead. So the final thing I want to do today is to use all of this to actually try to define the logarithm. Okay, so what is the goal? So the goal is to find a holomorphic function which we'll call log of z, such that e to the log z is always equal to z for all complex numbers. Okay. Now, firstly, one thing to observe is that the exponential function is never 0, right? So, so of course you can't take z to be 0. You can't define log of 0 because otherwise e to the log 0 will have to be equal to 0, but exponential of anything cannot be equal to 0, right? So I have to first, I mean, I can possibly define log z only for z non-zero. Okay, so that's the first restriction. So maybe for all possible z, for as maybe I'll be a bit vague, for as many z as possible. Okay, so this is a very vaguely phrased sentence, but hopefully I'll make a few observations and hopefully it will be clear why this is an important problem to determine what is sort of the largest set on which I can define the logarithm. So the first point is that x of z is never equal to 0. This implies that log z can only be defined if z is not equal to 0. So that's the first elementary observation, right? The second observation is that, so I mean, this log z ought to be some sort of an inverse function, right? But of course, you cannot have an inverse function unless you're, I mean, or at least you cannot have an inverse function in the most obvious way unless your function is injected. It's one-to-one, right? But here we don't have one-to-one because we know that e to the ip is equal to 1 whenever p is equal to 2 pi times an integer, right? So that means that the exponential function is not injective. So that's another issue. Okay. But there is some hope because you can look at the restriction to the real line. So let's talk about the restriction to the real line. So I'll denote it by the function e raised to x, which takes r to r plus, right? So we have already seen that this is surjective. That's one of the properties that we had listed. Also, this has to be injective because it's strictly increasing. So this implies that for all x, there exists a unique y, which we denote by, ln of x, such that e to the y is equal to x. Okay, because it's a bijective function. So for all x positive, this is certainly true. So now I want to somehow use this to at least construct a candidate for logarithm. Okay. So that's my next observation. This is a candidate for log z. Okay, so I'm going to use polar coordinates. So in polar coordinates, I want to write this as r e raised to I theta. So I want to define some log z, right? Now suppose log z is u plus iv. Okay, so let's say the real part of log z is u, the imaginary part of log z is v, and my goal is to determine, what these possible candidates for u and v. Okay, so let's plug this in. So my requirement is that e raised to log z has to be equal to z. Okay. But in polar coordinates, my z is basically r e to the I theta. Okay. So on the other hand, this is some e to the u plus iv. By the law of exponents, this is e raised to u times e raised to iv. Okay. So if you take absolute value of z, that is equal to r. But what is absolute value of e to the log z? This is absolute value of e to the u times e to the iv. This guy has absolute value 1. Why? Because e raised to iv is cos v plus I sine v, and the absolute value, I mean, cos v is real, sine v is real, the absolute value is cosine squared v plus sine squared v, which is 1. So the absolute value of this is precisely e raised to u. So that implies that e raised to u is r. But then this implies that u is forced to be this ln of r, the real logarithm that we study in high school. Okay. So that fixes what u can be. U has no choice. U has to be the real logarithm of r, ln of r, right? So u has no choice. But so if we put this in, we basically get that r e raised to I theta is equal to r e raised to iv. So this implies that e raised to I theta is equal to e raised to iv. So this implies that this v has multiple choices. This has to be theta plus 2n I pi. Plus 2n pi. So even though this is fixed, this has multiple choices. Okay, so here's a definition, or this is not a definition. So the point is, if you make a choice of n, then you actually get a logarithm, right? But now there's a problem. So the fifth observation is the problem. Because remember, my theta, which was basically the argument of z, had to take values between minus pi and pi, right? So now suppose you have a point here. Suppose z lies here. As you approach z from here, arg of z converges to minus pi. On the other hand, if you approach from the bottom, arg of z actually converges to plus pi. So the argument is actually not a continuous function. Okay. So in fact, the strategy is to basically remove this, right? And that's what I think Saurabh must have talked a bit about branch cuts. So the idea is to basically cut off this line segment or this infinite ray. Okay, and in fact, there's nothing special about this infinite ray. You can also cut off any other infinite ray emanating from the origin, but you in fact get the following theorem. So this has two parts. So one, there is no logarithm defined and holomorphic on all of C star. So it's not just a matter of not being clever enough, right? I mean, you could question me that, okay, maybe there is another, I mean, this is one candidate for the logarithm. Maybe if I were smarter, I could have come up with another logarithm that's defined on all of C star, for instance. But it turns out that this is impossible. Okay, and the second point is that there exists a holomorphic function, which I'll call by capital log z, defined on C minus the set where z is real and z is less than equal to 0, 2c star such that the exponential of log of z is identically equal to z, and in fact log of z is given by ln of mod z plus I times arg of z. Okay, and this is called the principal branch of the logarithm. Okay. You can of course add any multiples of 2n I pi and get other branches of logarithm defined with this branch. Okay. So the proof actually uses, I mean, there's no, I mean, the best way to prove this is using line integrals. Okay, so that's going to be the topic of next week, and hopefully he'll also prove the existence of logarithms. But sorry, I'm again, the absolutely last 3 minutes, I actually want to define, I don't want to leave you without defining a concrete logarithm. So I'm going to do this as the final thing for today, namely log as a power series. So I want to give you at least one definition of the logarithm. One concrete definition of the logarithm. Okay, and that's, I promise that's the absolute last thing we'll do today, and it will take only possibly 3 minutes. So let me, this again begins with an observation. Okay. Right. So let actually let me just do the following. Let me give you the answer. So consider the following power series. Okay, I'm going to define denote that by L of z. This is going to be the summation 0 to infinity minus 1 to the n, z minus 1 to the n by n. Okay, so let me draw a picture. So here is 1. You can check. So as an exercise, you can check that the radius of convergence of this power series is precisely equal to 1. So this power series actually converges on this disk of convergence. So you have convergence on this disk of convergence, okay? And then by our theorem, this defines a holomorphic function in that region. So I'm going to notice two things about this series. Firstly, what happens when you plug in z equals 1? When you plug in the point at the center. So if you write this out, this is going to be 1 minus z minus 1 plus z minus 1 squared by 2 and so on. So if you plug in z equals 1, this is going to be 0. Okay? And the second thing is what happens when you differentiate. Okay, so we do term by term differentiation. So this is summation n going from 1 to infinity minus 1 to the n times z minus 1 to the n minus 1 by n, which is summation n going from 1 to infinity minus 1 to the n z minus 1 to the n minus 1. So you change variables, put n minus 1 to be k. So then this is the summation k going from 0 to infinity minus 1 to the k minus 1 times z minus 1 to the k. Okay, or because I don't like this k minus 1, you can just write this as minus this summation. Okay, but then recall what is 1 by 1 plus w? This is precisely minus 1 to the k, w to the k. Our geometric series, right? So just put w equal to z minus 1. I think I might have made a right. I hope I've not made a sign mistake, but let's see. So put w equal to z minus 1. This summation is basically going to be minus k going from 0 to infinity, minus 1 to the k, w to the k. Okay, I think I might have made a mistake somewhere.
Sir, I think it will be on the summation part, it will be when we are putting k equal to n minus 1, then it should be minus 1 to the power k plus 1, I think.
Yeah, but that's fine, right? Because
Yeah, then minus k common. Yeah, that is fine.
that is fine.
Sir, in the definition, if you substitute z equals to 1, we are getting 1 instead of 0.
Oh, because, oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah. No, because, yeah, I have to start from n equals 1, right?
1, yes.
No, yeah, actually, that's right. That's right. So, yeah, you have to start with this and with a minus sign. Yeah, thanks. That's the problem. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. The definition should be this. Right? So then you basically have something like z minus 1 plus or minus z minus 1 squared by 2 and so on, right? Etc. So now when you put z equals 1, then you get 0. So this is fine. And then the derivative will have an n minus 1 here. So this will now be just k. Okay, so there won't be a minus sign. Yeah, thanks. So this will be this, which is precisely what I wanted. Yeah, so this implies that L prime of Z is equal to 1 by Z. So now let me end by saying, so let me prove that exponential of L of Z is actually always equal to Z. So that means L of Z actually defines a logarithm on this disk. So what is the proof? So again we do the usual thing, let exponential of L of Z be some function f of Z. Maybe I should do right. Let's do the following. Okay. Then what is f prime of Z? So what is no? So let me do it in 2 steps. What is f prime of Z? By chain rule, that is basically this times L prime of Z. Okay. But this is basically f of Z. So this is f of Z, and this is 1 over Z. So this is f of Z by Z. So we get that f prime is basically f by Z. Okay. So now you take the function g of Z, which is f of Z divided by Z. For Z, and of course Z is not equal to 0. So all of this is happening on the disk of radius 1 around 1, right? So then what is g prime of Z? By quotient rule, that is this. Okay, but this guy is basically 0. So this implies that g prime of z is 0 for all z in this disk. But this disk is connected, so again by this fact which I'll prove tomorrow, this implies that g is identically equal to a constant. In particular, g of z is identically equal to g of 1. But what is g of 1? G of 1 is f of 1 by 1. What is f of 1? That is by definition exponential of L of 1. But we have seen L of 1 is 0, exponential of 0 is 1, so g of z is 1. Okay, so that implies that g of z is always equal to 1, which implies that exponential of L of z is always equal to z for all z. Right, so we have found one holomorphic logarithm. So the conclusion is that L from the unit disk to C is a holomorphic logarithm. Okay, and I'll leave this as an exercise that if you take our principal branch of logarithm, restrict it to this disk. I have not yet shown you how to construct the principal branch of the logarithm. That can be done only once you introduce line integrals. But suppose you believe me that this can be constructed, then as an exercise using just chain rule, you can show that this is actually equal to L of z. So this L of z, which I've introduced as a power series, actually agrees with the principal branch of the logarithm. Okay, so I'll leave that as a nice exercise for you to work out. Okay, so I really apologize for going so much over time, but I guess I'm finally done for today. Any questions, or if you're not already sick of me?
Any questions?
Sir?
Yeah.
Sir, you have given the power series expansion of log z around z equal to 1.
Right.
So suppose I take z equal to 2 or z equal to 3 or some other center, then I get different power series?
Yes, you will, because this power series expansion only is convergent on that unit disk around z equals 1, right? So yeah, what do you do if you take z equals 2? So here's another claim that you can prove. So any holomorphic logarithm that one defines. Okay, so I'll call this some branch of logarithm that you define will have to satisfy this property that the derivative of logarithm is 1 by z. So no matter what logarithm you define, the derivative will always have to be 1 by z. Can you see how to prove this? Yeah. So a simple way to prove this is using this fact that what was the one defining property of the logarithm, that exponential of logarithm is the identity function, right? So now we differentiate on both sides. So this is going to be always 1. On the other hand, by chain rule, what is this? This is the exponential of log z times the derivative of log z. Right? So that means that the derivative of log z is basically 1 by exponential of log z, but exponential of log z is just z. So no matter what logarithm you define, the derivative always has to be 1 by z. So then if you want a power series expansion around z equals 2, you do the usual thing. Right, so for instance, if you take the holomorphic expansion around z equals 2, you basically take the nth derivative at 2, by n factorial times z minus 2 dn. Okay. That's all that you need to do. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. So, sir, expansion of any function in power series actually depends on the center about which we are expanding.
Exactly. That's the key point. Yeah. So you need to specify what center you are looking at, right? Because that will determine these coefficients of the power series expansion, right?
Yeah. Okay, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, if not, then tomorrow I'll talk about the Cauchy-Riemann equations, and then if time permits, I'll give you the proof of this periodicity. That it's kind of an important thing, but yeah, I don't. I mean, if I have time tomorrow, I'll give a proof. Okay.
So thank you, Professor Vedata. Excellent lecture.